Tonight we're going to look at the book of Philippians. It's a book I dearly love, and if you're ever a little bit down, a little bit discouraged, it's a book to turn to. You see, the book of Philippians was written by Paul from a jail cell. And I don't know if it was written as it was to help the people at Philippi as much as it was written to help Paul. But it seems in the letter there is some good news for Paul and the Philippians to help them both go on. But one of the big themes in the book of Philippians is the idea of joy. The words joy and rejoice are found 16 times in the book of Philippians. And it's a very short book. So tonight we're going to look at some of those and learn maybe where joy comes from. We want to begin back in John the 15th chapter, the words of Jesus, who really taught us about love. Not that we love God, but that God loved us. But Jesus in the 15th chapter of John first gave the illustration of the vine and the branches to his disciples shortly before he left them. In that particular illustration, he spoke of abiding in me and I in thee, and bearing fruit as we abide in him. In the 15th chapter, in verse 8, Jesus said, "Herein is my Father glorified, that ye bear much fruit, so shall ye be my disciples. As the Father hath loved me, so have I loved you. Continue ye in my love. If ye keep my commandments, ye shall abide in my love, even as I have kept my Father's commandments, and abide in his love." Summing up pretty much all the illustration of the vine and the branches, he then says, "These things have I spoken unto you, that my joy might remain in you." Jesus knew that upon his arrest and trial and death, there would be very little joy among his followers. There would be despair. They would flee as sheep being scattered abroad. Jesus understood that his presence with them had brought them comfort and confidence. But he's leaving. And so he wants them to understand that even though he's not with them physically, by abiding in him, they share his victory and his joy. I think it's a little bit odd that Jesus spoke of his joy. You think of the life of Jesus and you think of a life of difficulty and hardship. Actually, he was born and lay as a baby in a cow trough. He lived a very simple, poor life. He experienced a number of oppositions to his work in the ministry. His own people rejected him. His own family didn't believe in him. Many times he had to fight against the arguments made by the Pharisees and Sadducees to discredit him. But Jesus had joy. And I think one of the keys to the Christian life is the ability to understand that while one is in distress, whether it be in a jail or in despair or in hardship, there can still be joy. I can't imagine what must have been going through Jesus' mind as he faced Calvary. And here in chapter 15, he exactly does that. He's preparing to leave. He knows what's coming. And yet to his apostles he speaks of my joy. There is joy in victory. There is joy in doing what's right. There is a joy that comes from finishing the task. And that's the kind of joy I have to believe Jesus felt and understood. I have spoken these things unto you that my joy might remain in you. It's interesting that Jesus suggests here that the things he taught are somehow able to infuse us with joy. In this illustration, he spoke of my words abiding in you. And so here he closes by saying, my joy may remain in you by this which I have spoken unto you. Kind of remarkable that simple words could bring joy. But if those words are the words of God, if those words are the words of truth and promise and hope, yes, they can bring joy. I have spoken unto you that my joy might remain in you and that your joy might be full. All the joy that we can have, all the joy we can stand, that our joy might be full. And so Jesus recognized a kind of joy that was different from what normally is described as joy. Now turn with me to the 16th chapter of John. Let's notice some more of what Jesus had to say about this joy. In the 19th verse of John 16, he continues his discourse with his disciples. Verse 17, he says, I'm not going to be with you long. A little while and I'll be gone. I go to the Father. Now Jesus knew that they were desirous to ask him, and so he said to them, do you inquire among yourselves of that I said, a little while and you shall not see me? And again, a little while and you shall see me? Verily, verily, I say unto you that you shall weep and lament. The disciples didn't always have joy. The ones who followed at the cross. The ones who visited the tomb. There was no joy. The apostles had stood back in awe that their master had been killed. There was no joy. And so Jesus describes, and he says, you're going to weep and lament, but the world shall rejoice. Strange, isn't it? It's strange indeed what the world calls joy. The Jews were going to be happy. The Roman leaders were going to be happy. There was going to be singing and dancing in the streets because Jesus was dead. Not all joy is appropriate joy. Some joy is empty, meaningless. And I dare say some of the things that bring us joy are probably the same. Vain and empty. But notice Jesus continues and he says, ye shall be sorrowful, but your sorrow shall be turned into joy. There's an interesting thing that happens in the Scriptures concerning joy. Joy often follows sorrow. I don't know why that is. I don't know what there is about difficulty and despair and grief that allows us to have joy. But it's almost as though if there were no pain, if there were no despair, there may not be any joy. Jesus had joy, but it came at a price. And so he suggests here, there will be sorrow and there will be grief and there will be weeping, but there will also be joy. Every cloud has a silver lining. Every day of crying will be turned to joy. When we attend a funeral, it's not the end. It's not over. When we watch people suffer, it's not the end. It's not over. Your sorrow shall be turned to joy. And then he gives illustration. I think it's fascinating, the illustration he gives. Verse 21. A woman who's having a baby. You ever ask a woman how much it hurt to give birth? They compare it so many different things. And they say, but it's far worse. But I've had a number of mothers to say, you know, you forget it. You forget it. Notice what Jesus says. A woman having a baby has sorrow. Not a lot of joy in that delivery room. Because her hour is come and the labor begins. There is pain and there is suffering and there is travail. But as soon as she is delivered of the child, and they bring that newborn to her and put it in her arms, the memory of a lot of that pain seeps away. I've seen that in my wife. I've seen that in my daughter-in-law. And I assume it happens pretty normal. And that's why you ask some women, well, how much did it hurt when you had a baby? Well, I can't really remember. I can't really recall. Wish I could say it about kidney stones. And maybe to some extent we can, Mark, but it's not as much fun. I tell people, I said, after you have a kidney stone, you go home with a little rock in a jar. Pet rock is okay, but I'd much rather have a baby. Much rather. But what Jesus says is she's in pain and she suffers, but when she's delivered of a child, she remembers no more of the anguish for joy that a man is born into the world. And another thing, she doesn't have time to grieve and remember the pain. She's a busy girl from here on for quite a while. Isn't that something? So Jesus says just like that, and ye now therefore have sorrow, but I will see you again, and your heart shall rejoice, and your joy no man takes from you. To see Jesus again will make us forget all the pain and all the sorrow. This was true of the apostles because after the resurrection, he's going to appear to them again. We who have not physically seen Jesus or been with Jesus have also dealt with our sorrow and our grief and our pain. But what when we see him, when he returns? How will it all feel then? I think we'll be like that mother who can't remember the birth pains. I think it'll be like forgetting and not remembering the anguish of life. And that's joy. And then he says, in that joy no man can take away from you. Joy many times in our society is considered very fickle. It comes and goes. You have a good day, you have a bad day. Jesus said, here's a joy that's just solid like a rock. And that joy comes from seeing and being with Jesus. But now remember what he just got through illustrating. Abide in me and I in you. You see, if we're following Christ, we never leave him. He never leaves us. And we have joy. We have joy. We have joy because of his presence. We have joy because of his words and his comfort and his promises. And that joy is real. Now, if you will, turn with me to 2 Corinthians, the 7th chapter. Let the Apostle Paul give us some insights into joy. Later in Sunday school, we're going to be studying 2 Corinthians, and so I'll jump ahead and give you something from the 7th chapter here. 2 Corinthians chapter 7. Paul here is defending himself for his teaching and preaching and correcting Corinthian brethren. In verse 3, he defends himself this way. He says, I'm saying these things not to condemn you. For I've said before that you are in our hearts to die and live with you. Great is my boldness of speech toward you. Great is my glorying of you. I am filled with comfort. I am exceeding joyful in all our tribulation. Wait a minute. exceeding joyful in all our tribulation. Tribulation is trouble. Paul, what are you talking about? Well, look at verse 5. For when we were come into Macedonia, our flesh had no rest, but we were troubled on every side. Without were fightings, within were fears. Nevertheless, and here's the key to joy. Nevertheless, God that comforts those that are cast down comforted us by the coming of Titus. You can imagine Paul in the midst of an uncomfortable world, in the midst of despair and pain and suffering. Our flesh had no rest. We were troubled on every side. There were fightings. There were fears. But thanks be to God for the arrival of Titus. You know, just when it gets to feeling like the whole world's caving in on you, a friend can call. A loved one can put their arm around you. Like this morning, you can get a good old bear hug from some of you people. What happens? The joy comes back. The joy comes back. Joy defeats all pain and all trouble. Joy brings us back. It brings us back to Jesus. God who comforts those who are cast down comforted us by the coming of Titus. Great lesson to learn here, too, is that, remember, God comforts others by your actions. Titus was an instrument of the comfort God gave Paul. And we all need some of that. We all need some of that. Titus brought him joy. And Paul says, not by his coming only, but by the consolation wherewith he was comforted in you, when he told us your earnest desire, your mourning, your fervent mind toward me, so that I rejoice the more. Number one, he came, was comfort to me. Number two, he told me something good about the brethren at Corinth. And so he just kind of moved up another level of joy. We are comforting to one another. By our successes, by our efforts, by our fervent desire to do the Lord's will, by our faithfulness, for your fervent mind toward me, so that I rejoiced even the more. I have to remind you, he's in a jail cell. And not a very pleasant one. It's a Roman cell. And there's not much hope there. But he found joy. Now let's go back to the book of Philippians. The actual letter he wrote from that situation. Chapter 1 and verse 4. Always in every prayer of mine for you all, making request with joy for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now. Paul found joy in the unity and fellowship with brethren. Joy. Sometimes I think to myself, how many people miss out on that joy. I was just telling somebody this morning, it's been years since my dad was able to even attend the worship service. I don't know what that do to me. What would that do to you? Occasionally, brethren would stop in and see him. One fellow even brought him peaches and moon pies. He loved that. Occasionally, family would drop in. For years, without singing with the brethren and praying with the brethren and worshiping with the brethren. I'm not sure my faith would take that much. And I think I'd lose a lot of joy. And so Paul says, your fellowship in the gospel has brought me joy. And I know that God's working out things in your lives, and that makes me hopeful. of you. Now let's look at chapter 1 and verse 18. What then? Notwithstanding, every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and I therein do rejoice, yea, and will rejoice. Now this context is really strange because Paul is mentioning those who were preaching the truth, but who didn't like him. They weren't friends of Paul. Matter of fact, they were trying to hurt him. But they were preaching the truth. And I've often thought about this. You know, if preachers had competition, if there were preachers who were preaching against preachers, but they were all preaching the truth, how should they feel about one another? Thanks be to God, the truth is being preached. Whatever they think of me. Whatever it does to my name and reputation. The truth is being preached. And I therein do rejoice. Don't you love to hear about a good work somewhere where a gospel preacher or members are teaching, converting people to Christ, and hear about the changes that are happening? We just got an email from Joe Zell in the Philippines. He baptized somebody the other night in the middle of the night. Never meet those people, never know them. I got a piece of joy. Just knowing that kind of thing is still happening in the world. There are still people, tender, who are coming to the Lord for salvation. And as hard as Paul worked to teach the gospel, every message of a conversion gave him joy. And how it must have hurt him to be locked up in a cell where he couldn't be a part of it. He still enjoyed it. He still received joy from it. Now look at verse 25 of chapter 1. And having this confidence, I know that I shall abide and continue with you all for your furtherance and joy of faith, that your rejoicing may be more abundant in Jesus Christ for me by my coming to you again. Notice that expression, your joy of faith. They were remaining faithful to the Lord. There's great reason for joy. Remember the parable Jesus gave of the shepherd who had the 99 sheep and he left the 99 to go after the one that was lost. And he came home rejoicing that he had found that sheep that was lost. Why didn't he stay home and rejoice over the other? There's just something especially joyous about a sheep coming home. Right? When I was growing up, we had a lot of cows on the farm. And we had what they call widow fences, so the cows always got out. A lot of times I'd get home from school, I'd have to chase cows. One of my favorite jobs ever. I told my dad I'll never raise cows. Never. We were racing and chasing cows through a creek one night. It was a pitch black night, and I ran smack dab into a tree. And I said, no, I'll not do this for a living. And I didn't. All the other cows would be in the barn. We wouldn't go out in the dark at night hunting for them or giving them any attention or spoiling those cows. All we cared about was the ones who were lost. And there's great joy when you find them. One thing, you get to go to bed. That's good. But you've got the cows back. And so Paul felt that way. And it brought him joy. Chapter 2 and verse 2. You fulfill my joy, he says, that ye be like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. What a wonderful thing it is for brethren to dwell together in love. Paul had received a message that the Philippians were obeying God and were living together in love, and that brought him great joy. Peace brings joy. If you don't believe that, you get in the middle of a war, and you'll find how joyous quickly, swiftly, it seeps away. Whether it's a spiritual war or a physical war, joy comes where people stand together. The unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace is a powerful ingredient for joy. Fulfill my joy and stay together. I will paraphrase that verse. But again in verse 17 of chapter 2, yea, and if I be offered upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I'm going to regret it all my life. That's not what it says, is it? Read it. If I be offered upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I joy and rejoice with you all. If you people kill me, I'll find some joy. Strange place to find joy, isn't it? Isn't that the kind of joy Jesus had? If you kill me, I'll find some joy. And that's what they did at Calvary, didn't it? They killed him, but they couldn't take away his joy. Because he died out of love. He died in service to people. He died because of his love for God and for his fellow man. And so Paul speaks of that joy. And it's a joy we all can share. Verse 18 says, for the same cause also ye joy and rejoice with me. More blessed to give than it is to receive. More joyous to help somebody than it is to be helped by somebody. More joyous to be sacrificial than it is to be recipient. It's taught all the way through the Bible. And Paul found joy even in that. Verses 28 and 29. And I sent him therefore unto you, and this he's talking about Epaphroditus in verse 25. I sent him therefore the more carefully, that when you see him again you may rejoice, and I may be the less sorrowful. Receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such in reputation. Because for the work of Christ he was nigh unto death, not regarding his life, to supply your lack of service toward me. Here was someone else who was willing to go the extra mile. He was willing to do all he could to help the brethren in Philippi and to help Paul. And so Paul says, when you receive him, you may rejoice. Why? He cares about you. I wonder sometimes today if people really do rejoice because people care about them. Some people don't seem to care if anybody cares about them. That doesn't seem to mean much to anybody in many situations. But Paul said, here's somebody who truly cares about you. When he shows up, you need to throw a party. You need to get your joy on. Because this man went to it for you. This man has done it for you. This man cares for you. I rejoice when I see a doctor that really cares about his patients. I rejoice when I go to the dentist who really seems to have compassion for the pain that he inflicts in my mouth. Don't you? I like that. I like it that somebody cares. I was telling some of them this morning, I'd never seen this happen ever in my life, but a nurse came into the corpse of my father. He died minutes before. And bless her heart, she leaned over him and she said, Mr. Shorty, I don't want to hurt you. But she said, I have to take this IV out. And she bent over and she carefully removed that tape. And she said, you've been hurt enough, and we wouldn't want you to be hurt. He was dead. Man, I want that nurse when I die. I want that nurse when I suffer. There's joy in someone who cares. Great joy. And Paul felt it. Then in chapter 3, verse 1, finally, my brethren, rejoice in the Lord. That's interesting. Paul didn't say rejoice in your job and rejoice in your family and rejoice in the world. Sometimes that doesn't work out too well. Inasmuch as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men, and as much as lieth in you, as well as you can. But there is joy in the Lord. There is joy in abiding in the vine. There's a joy that comes from following the words of our Lord. And then he repeats this again in chapter 4. And in chapter 4 and verse 1 he says, dearly beloved and longed for, my joy and crown. So stand fast in the Lord, my dearly beloved. My joy and crown. People can be our joy. People should be our joy. We should rejoice in those who love us, our families, our friends, our brethren. We should find joy there, even as Paul did in his life. And then verse 4, he repeats from what he said in chapter 3 and verse 1, rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. It's almost as though Paul is saying, I know you heard me the first time, but I'm going to say it again. So you'll be sure to get it this time. Rejoice in the Lord. There were problems at Philippi. There were problems in the church. There were problems with people's health and lives. There were people who didn't get along. And chapter 4, verse 2 talks about two ladies who evidently had a quarrel. Paul basically is saying you need to get back to the joy. If you have a falling out with somebody, don't let it drag away your joy. We need to keep our joy as best we can. And then in verse 10, but I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at the last your care of me hath flourished again, wherein you were also careful, but you lacked opportunity. Paul isn't critical. The Philippians had failed to communicate any support for him for some time. He doesn't say, where you folks been? He doesn't condemn their inactivity. But when their support comes, he rejoices. He rejoices at what little or what lot they were able to do for him. Some people are greedy. They expect a lot. They expect people to do a lot for them. And when they don't, they get defensive. Paul was in jail. He couldn't do anything about it. But when help came, he appreciated it. And he found joy in what others did for him. And so tonight, joy, which could be translated delight or gladness, joy. Galatians 5, it's found as one of the first fruits of the Spirit. Because it comes through God's Spirit working in conjunction with the words of the Lord into our lives. Just like the vine and the branches. We abide in Him. We share His attitudes. We share His understandings. We share His definition of words. And by doing that, we can come to appreciate and enjoy joy. Not joy in the world. Not joy in frivolous things, but a joy that continues on and on, as long as we abide in the Lord. There are those here tonight who find yourselves not abiding in Christ as the vine, the branches, not feeding upon His Word, following His directions in your life. Joy is going to be hard to come by. but joy is of the Lord. And His joy can remain in us. As we render obedience to His commands, turning from sin in our lives, trusting in Him as Lord and Master, putting Him on in baptism as we turn from sin, and then to abide in Him. The word abide means to live in Him. It's the house where we live. It's our address from then on. But as long as we abide there, there will be joy as we stand together and ask